Okay, today we're looking at the rise of Islam and how that is going to have an influence and impact in India. Well, Islam is going to appear in the Arabian Peninsula to begin with, and that is basically Southwest Asia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Israel. That area is where Islam is going to appear. And it begins with the Prophet Muhammad, and he's known as the last prophet for Islam anyway. He's born in 570 in the city of Mecca, and he grew up and he became a merchant. And he eventually is going to marry a woman named Khadijah, and she's a very wealthy widow that he marries. She's a bit older than him, so he marries an older woman. But he has several children with her, and eventually in about 610, so when he's about 40 years old, he has a vision where he hears the voice of the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel tells him that he is to become a messenger of God, or Allah. According to the Muslim tradition, Abraham and Moses and Jesus were prophets also, and Muhammad is the last one. He is the last bringer of God's truth to earth. And he is going to found the religion of Islam, and roughly translated, Islam means submission, and so you submit to God. And so a Muslim is someone who submits to the will of God, who puts God's will before his own. So, within the Islamic tradition, you have a religious community called an ummah, and it's kind of based on the tribes, but eventually they lose their tribal bonds and become more of a religious community. But the ummah's goal is to achieve God's will on earth. Now, at first, very few are going to listen to Muhammad. In fact, most of them thought he was just plain crazy. And so he's going to be faced with the threat of murder. And because of that, Muhammad is going to leave the city of Mecca, his hometown, for the city of Yathrib. And this becomes a turning point for Islam, because as he leaves, he is going to spread his ideas and his reputation is going to grow. And so when he returns to Mecca 8 years later, he's actually welcomed back, which is really a huge turning point, considering 8 years prior to that, he was going to be killed if he remained in the city. And then 8 years later, they're like, oh, please come back to us, kind of thing. So he returns back to Mecca, continues spreading the word of Islam, and he dies 2 years later. Abu Bakr becomes the first caliph, which is a successor to Muhammad. So he's going to take over after Muhammad. And there's a lot of people who weren't so happy with that. And in fact, Abu Bakr is going to say, if you worship Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. So that means your religion is dead. But if you worship God, God is alive. And there are other people who can be his voice piece, who can spread his message, the message of Islam here on earth. So what is the message of Islam? Well, Islam is a monotheistic religion, which means that they believe in one all-powerful, compassionate God named Allah. They also have a sacred text called the Quran, which is the sacred text of Islam. They also believe in the concept of hell and paradise. After you die, your actions determine if you go to hell or if you go to heaven or go to paradise. But they have no official priests like the Christian faith does. So they have kind of a different structure to it. There are 5 pillars of Islam, or 5 foundational beliefs of Islam. The first is a declaration of faith, that you profess your belief in other prophets like Abraham and Moses and Jesus, but you believe that Muhammad is the last prophet and the greatest. The second pillar is daily prayer, and when Muslims pray, they face the holy city of Mecca to pray. And you can pray anywhere at any time, but many will gather together in mosques, and a mosque is the Islamic house of worship, and they pray 5 times a day. The third pillar is giving charity to the poor, helping out those more in need than you. The fourth pillar is fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and you fast from sunrise to sunset, which basically means you don't eat or drink anything from sunrise to sunset during the holy month, and then from sunset to sunrise you can eat and drink, but you're not supposed to over excessively eat and drink. The fifth pillar is called Hajj, and Hajj is a pilgrimage to Mecca. So you make one visit to the holy city, and you're expected to go at least once in your lifetime if you can. Now, some will also consider jihad a duty, and a jihad is an effort in God's service. Today, jihad is used in a lot of different ways, but the most frequent is that it's interpreted to mean holy war. But most Muslims believe that that's not a correct interpretation of the word jihad, that it should also include acts of charity, and that you are internally struggling for spiritual peace, that it's more about an internal struggle to make yourself better, as opposed to conducting a holy war against other religions. Now, the Muslim belief will also forbid alcohol and gambling and usury. And usury is giving out loans with very high interest rates. Like I said, the Quran is the sacred text. It is the sacred word that was revealed to Muhammad, and it emphasizes honesty and generosity and social justice. And eventually the Muslims will develop the Sharia, which is a system of laws based upon the Quran. Islam is very similar to Christianity and Judaism. Some of the similarities that they share is that they all share the same God. They just all know that God by different names. They also share the same prophets, but their belief in the prophet's power and validity is different. They also believe in a heaven and hell concept, so they're very similar in that way. The differences between Islam and Christianity and Judaism is that for the Muslims, the Quran is the complete revelation of God's word. It's kind of the, the third in the trilogy kind of thing. They believe in the Torah, they believe in the Bible, but they also believe in the Quran, and that the Quran is kind of the conclusion of God's word. They're also very religiously tolerant. Judaism is also very religiously tolerant, but Christianity not so much. And so that's kind of the difference between them. They also treat Christians and Jews as people of the book, that they believe in the same God and that they're a continuation kind of thing. They just think that Christians and Jews have not looked beyond the gospel for God's word, and so they think that they're kind of ignorant sort of thing. So, that's kind of Islam in a nutshell. So we're going to look at women in early Muslim society. Before Islam in India, their women's positions are going to vary. Some will have more freedom, some will be more controlled. But after Islam is introduced into India, we're going to see more equality of men and women. For example, Islam is going to prohibit the killing of daughters. Because in India, you wanted to have sons, because sons take care of you. Daughters go to somebody else's family and take care of them. And so Islam is actually going to prohibit the killing of daughters. So that's kind of a benefit to India. Inheritance laws are going to be more favorable to women under Islam than they were under Hinduism or Buddhism. It also provides protection for widows, because remember, in Hinduism, if you were a widow, what was the expectation? That you were to die to prove that you were a virtuous woman. And so Islam provides protection for those widows, that you didn't have to throw yourself on your husband's funeral fire. Islam also required consent for marriage and allowed women to be free to divorce their husbands, which under Hinduism and Buddhism was not allowed. And women will have greater access to education under Islam. Although sons get a larger portion of the inheritance, women were also given, rights to inheritance. In Islam, men are allowed 4 wives, but only if they are able to treat them all equally and provide for them. So if a man is unable to provide for his 4 wives equally, he can't have them. So a woman could be free to leave her husband if she's not getting the adequate care that she thinks she needs. So it sounds great that a guy can have 4 wives, but he also has to be able to provide equally for those 4 wives and do it well. So it's kind of an expense for him. So most Muslim men do not have multiple wives. as Islam spreads, it's going to adopt a lot of the traditions of the places that it comes to. So, for example, the veiling of women, where women have to wear veils on their faces to cover as much of their body as possible, that's a tradition that was part of the region it went to. And so Islam sort of adopts it. The secluding of women, like putting them into a harem and forbidding them to leave it, is again a tradition that Islam encounters but adopts as it adapts to its environment. And in some cases, women were seldom let out of their home in some areas of India. And when Islam comes there, they kind of adopt that as well. For example, in some areas of India, it's acceptable for a woman to leave their home only 3 times in their lives. To leave it to get married, to leave when their parents died, and on her death, when the woman dies. That was the 3rd time she's allowed to leave her home. So a lot of people have misconceptions that it was Islam that brought those traditions, but instead they were adopting the national or the cultural traditions of the areas that they came to. It's not that they brought that was incorporated within.